Hi, thanks for joining me today. We're going to focus on osteology, the study of bones, and then also arthrology today. And so we're going to start with osteology. First, I want to talk about bones' competing functions. So there are 5 functions of bones. One is to provide structure and support to the body. So specifically, if you think about soft tissues of the body, the legs, for example, are supported by the bones of the lower extremity, the femurs, the tibia, the fibula. The rib cage is a support for the thoracic wall. So providing structure and support is the important function for bones. Next, we have protection. So if you think about the skull is very important protection for our very important brains. We have vertebrae, for example, that are supporting and providing protection for the spinal cord. We also have the rib cage, as I just talked about, for structure and support, also being a protection for the organs, for the lungs and the heart. We also have movement as a very important function for bones. So this is one competing function or function of bones that isn't noted in your textbook, but it's important that these bones are important as levers. So they're serving as levers. The joints become fulcra. These bones are attachment sites for muscles, and that allows us to do so many things, right? Move my arms around, allows me to walk around, even speak to you, allows me to breathe. So bones are important for movement of the body. Couldn't move as well as we do without these bones. Bones also are mineral storehouses. The primary minerals that bones store are calcium and phosphorus. These are released into the bloodstream as our bodies need them if they're not taken in already by our diets. The deposits and withdrawals of bones by these minerals go on continuously. So calcium is a very important mineral for functioning of muscles. So if calcium in our blood becomes very low because it's not intaken by our diet, then the body will start to resorb bone. Resorption means that it removes bone in order to get the calcium out of the bone and then increase our blood level of calcium. So important mineral storehouse. The 5th function is hematopoiesis. So this is blood cell production. And that is occurring in marrow and bone marrow. And that's something we'll talk about as we talk about the different types of bones, the bone marrow, and then a little bit about blood cell production. So these are 5 functions of bone: structure and support, protection, movement, mineral storehouse, and blood cell production. And I say at the bottom here that these are competing functions. And I say that because increasing one of the functions decreases another function. So if you think, for example, that your bones are storing minerals, and maybe they're storing lots of minerals, right? They're really good storehouses of minerals. That's good on one hand, good that it's allowing good storage, but that also makes bones more porous. And more porous bones tend to be weaker. They're not as strong, and because of that, they could fracture more easily. So high mineral storage, that's good, but lower for the structure support, not so good. Another example might be your bones could be pretty heavy, right? And that would allow greater structure, greater support, greater protection. However, that might make movement more difficult if our bones are very heavy. So competing functions, and these functions are really in conflict with one another based on kind of those examples that I gave. And I'm sure you could think of other ways that these are competing functions as well. There are several ways to classify bones. One way is to describe where they are in the body. So there's the axial and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is highlighted in this slide as yellow, and that is going to include the skull, the vertebral column, and then also the rib cage. So that's our axial skeleton here in yellow. And then we have what we call the appendicular skeleton. That's what I've written down here, appendicular. And that refers to these extremities. So here's our upper extremity, and I noted last time that we refer to this as brachium. Here's our antebrachium and hand. And then also the lower extremities. So these limbs attaching to the axial skeleton allow for things like locomotion, manipulation of our environment, that sort of thing. So this is one way to classify bones, axial versus appendicular skeleton. Bones could contribute to each of those. We could also classify bones based on the shape that they have. So this figure here is demonstrating different types of bones and where you might find those bones in the body. So we're going to start with long bones, and this is demonstrating the humerus, our brachial bone. For long bones, they are longer than they are wide. They tend to have a shaft, this middle part, with two ends that are sort of enlarged. And I'm going to talk in a future slide about long bones in a little bit more detail, give some specific names for what these shaft and these ends actually are called. Most of our limb bones are long bones. So we see that here in the humerus. It turns out that these bones here, radius and ulna, all these phalanges and metacarpal bones, those are all considered long bones. So it's not really the length of the bone that makes it a long bone, it's actually the structure, the support. So these little phalanges, like if I think about just this little bone here on the tip of my finger, that's considered a long bone even though it's not nearly as long as my humerus. Right? We also have short bones in our body, and this is showing the carpal bones, the bones of our wrist and hand that are short bones. These are cube-shaped, so they tend to be about as wide as they are long. And the carpal bones is one place we see short bones. We also see those in the tarsals, those bones of our feet that are analogous with the carpal bones of our hand. We also have flat bones, so this is showing the parietal bone. Parietal bone is one of our skull bones. And this is thin, flattened. It's usually curved sort of a bone, so this skull parietal bone is a good example of that. Another example would be our sternum, our breastbone, or the ribs. Those are also flat bones. We also have several irregular bones of our body. The vertebrae are a good example. So these are very complicated shaped bones. Just looking at the vertebrae, you can tell that it's a pretty complicated shape. The pelvic bones, the bones of our hips, are also considered to be irregular bones because they don't conform to this long bone or flat bone structure quite as well. So an irregular bone is another way to classify a bone. And then finally, the sesamoid bone. Sesamoid refers to sesame seeds. Those are kind of the shape that these bones have, like a sesame seed. These are a type of short bone that are actually embedded within a tendon. So the most common example that we think of is the patella. The patella is our kneecap, and the patella is a sesamoid bone. It's actually embedded within the tendon of the quadriceps muscles. We have sesamoid bones in other parts of our body, particularly our hands and feet, but the patella is probably the most commonly referred to sesamoid bone of our body. So that was another way to classify bones by their shape. And I'm going to go on now to talk more about long bones, these bones that we commonly find in our limbs. So first, here on the left-hand side, I want you to notice how the long bones have a proximal, this is closer to the axial skeleton, and a distal end with a shaft in the middle. These proximal and distal ends are called epiphyses. So that's what's named here, epiphysis. And then the middle, the shaft of it, is called a diaphysis. So we have an epiphysis on either end, diaphysis in the middle. These epiphyses tend to be more spongy bones. So we have two types of bone in our body. And this image here is showing a metaphysis, which is between an epiphysis and a diaphysis on either end, both the proximal and distal. And this is demonstrating that we have this more spongy bone compared to the diaphysis. So in the epiphysis and the metaphysis here, we have more spongy bone. In the shaft and the diaphysis, we tend to have more solid, hard cortical bone. And notice here how we have this ring of cortical bone, and then in the middle of it, we have sort of an empty tube. This empty tube demonstrated here, and then also in this image here, is called the medullary canal. So here are these epiphyses. These are bony ends that are more expanded. They tend to have compact bone on the outside, which is shown here, compact bone here, with spongy bone in the middle. On this end, it's demonstrating that there is intra-articular area. We're not going to talk too much about that, but articular, we know, refers to joints, and at the end of this joint, we may have some articular cartilage. I want to note here that we have a metaphysis, and in that metaphysis, we have a physis, and this physis is where we find a growth plate. So physis and growth plate are synonymous with one another. These growth plates are also called epiphyseal plates in children, and epiphyseal plates allow for growth of long bones. So the way this works is that there is this growth plate that's between the epiphysis and diaphysis. On the epiphyseal side, so the kind of more proximal or more distal side, hyaline cartilage is produced. And I talked before about how hyaline cartilage is a precursor to the skeleton. So hyaline cartilage is produced on the epiphyseal side. And then on the diaphyseal side, the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage, is replaced by bone. So the bone is continuing to grow throughout childhood, throughout puberty. And then it stops producing cartilage on the epiphyseal side. The plate eventually becomes completely ossified, becomes completely bony. And when it's completely bony, it's then, instead of being called epiphyseal plate, it's then called an epiphyseal line. So adults have epiphyseal lines when the bone has stopped growing. This site, this growth plate, epiphyseal plate, is really an important site in children because it's important to fracture. So if a child fractures their epiphyseal plate, depending on the severity of that fracture, they may have trouble continuing to allow that bone to grow. So that can be a problem. It's also a site that you wouldn't want to do ultrasound over in children because of this, the importance of it in their growth. So I mentioned you have this diaphysis. The diaphysis has this middle area called the medullary cavity. In long bones, this medullary cavity holds yellow bone marrow. So there's two types of bone marrow in the body, yellow and red. In long bones, this medullary cavity contains yellow bone marrow. Both types of bone marrow are sort of a semi-soft, gelatinous material. So that was all about long bones. This is a figure from your textbook, but some of these figures are very dense. They have sort of like different sections and tend to be sort of a lot of images in one. So in this case, I've kind of broken that out a little bit more. So that's why it looks maybe a little bit blurry in this slide, just because I've taken it from a larger image. So, but I want to kind of blow it up and spend a little bit of time focusing on that one. And I did the same with this next slide that I'll show you after this one, where I have an osteon.